Hello, everyone, and welcome to Profitable Pastures 2021. My name is Patricia Ellingwood, and I'm the Executive Assistant of the Ontario Forage Council. This is the first of 4 webinars for this year's virtual conference. Thank you to the Beef Farmers of Ontario for their generous partnership of this year's webinar series. Today's webinar is brought to you by the Canadian Forage and Grassland Association and Trillium Mutual Insurance Company. If you are on social media, please use the hashtag Profitable Pastures. Today's session is called What's New at the Ontario Beef Research Centre. Our presenters are Drs. Kim Schneider, Katie Wood, and Ira Mandell. Dr. Schneider is the new assistant professor in the forage and service crops at the University of Guelph. Dr. Wood is an assistant professor studying ruminant nutrition. And Dr. Mandell is an associate professor studying beef nutrition and meat quality. These 3 researchers will provide us an update on the new facilities and the pastures in Elora, as well as look into ongoing and upcoming projects at Elora and New Liskeard. Enjoy the presentation.
All right, thanks for that introduction, Patricia. The 3 of us have kind of tag teamed our presentation here. And so I am the guinea pig here that's going first. Certainly welcome to tonight's webinar. We've got a lot of new, really exciting changes that have happened at the Ontario Beef Research Centre. And through tonight's webinar, we want to highlight some of the new innovations with our new research center, as well as some of the interesting pasture research that's ongoing and starting at the research center. So first, I'll give you a little bit of a tour about the new cow-calf facility, and then I'll pass it on to Dr. Mandell, who will talk a little bit more about the pasture and some of the results from some of his recent pasture studies. And then Dr. Kim Schneider will take over talking about some of her recent pasture work. And then I'll kind of close out the evening talking about some of our new pieces of technology and some research using some of the cool tools that we have at the station. So our vision for the facility is certainly to become the center for beef cattle production and grazing research in Eastern Canada. We certainly recognize the need for production-based research in the eastern part of the country, and certainly we want to be the leader in this area, as well as a global leader in beef research. And certainly while doing that, we want to help all beef producers lower costs of production and increase profitability. So in general, the facility encompasses a variety of different research areas, but we have some centralized themes, which include safeguarding the environment, improving animal health, animal welfare, production and reproduction, improving food safety, meeting demands of beef consumers, and increasing beef quality. And so regardless of the themes that we talk about tonight, usually they surround some of these core pillars for research. So as I mentioned, there's been a lot of things that have changed in the past couple of years. If you've happened to drive down the second line, you probably won't recognize it anymore. The biggest being that our new cow facility opened in October of 2019. So this is a 165,000 square foot facility, and it is designed in an H configuration with 24 cow pens and 16 heifer pens in each barn. And certainly this provides a space where we can have a house of cows all under one roof and modernize the facilities so that we can conduct accurate research and trying to minimize the cost of research as well. And I'll talk about that in a second here. So the barn, as you can see, is designed in this H configuration with the crossover area here with the central animal processing facility, as well as an animal health room. And the barn itself is designed with a center drow valley down each of the wings of the barn. It is a bedded pack design, and so animals are bedded at the back area of the pen, and they can drag some of that bedding out onto the scrape alley, which is where the feeders are located. So the feeders are on the outside of the barn, allowing for easy feeding and for housing some of our feed intake monitoring equipment. The whole barn itself as well is naturally ventilated with turkey curtains here that of course are all automatically controlled using thermocouples and sensors. And when the curtains are open, it provides a nice breezy natural environment and accounting for the kind of the natural ventilation that passes through from west to east. And so, as you can see, we've got a couple of the heifers here. This is the scrape alley with the feeders along the outside. And then looking from the outside of the pens, you can see some of our new feed intake monitoring equipment, which I'll talk about in a second here. So to give you kind of an idea of the scope, this is standing at one end of the barn, one end looking towards the west. And you can see how kind of long and expansive the barn is. You can see a lot of the fans for natural ventilation. And this certainly was right before cattle moved in, so it's all brand new spick and span with no cow pies in it yet. Now, the capacity for the barn is 288 mature cows and 96 replacement heifers. And so if those of you that may not be familiar with the cow herd, we use an Angus cross base for the cow herd, and we use fixed time AI so that we have that additional control over breeding and for any genetic studies that occur as well. In addition, certainly there are not yet 288 cows on site. About 140 or so Elora cows are currently in the barn with plans that the amalgamation of the cows from New Liskeard will move to the Elora site at the end of 2021. In addition to kind of the heifer area, we also have a specialized maternity area, which you can see in the bottom picture here. You may notice this funny wall, which looks a little bit out of place, but that is supposed to be there. And you can see the curtain that's rolled up on each of those entrances. This area, we can actually lower the curtain and there is some heating that we can provide in that area. And so we could do some specialized research where maybe we need to heat that area and particularly in the winter, if we're worrying about infusing lines, freezing and things like that, that is something that we can do in that maternity area. It's designed for adaptability. And so although most of the time, if we're not doing research, they can be used as maternity pens, there is a configuration that we can set up that essentially turns some of those pens into a tie stall. So if we need to do more intensive type research, we can do that in that area. As I mentioned, one of the unique features about our barn is it is set up for individual data capture. So certainly one of the key things that we need to capture when we're doing a lot of experiments, particularly nutrition-based experiments, is feed intake. And so we use the Incentic feeding system, which is seen here with these blue bunks. And it uses RFID technology to be able to identify the individual animal as she enters the feed bunk. It will take a before weight, and then as she eats, it will weigh the feed. And as she leaves the feed bunk, it'll take an end weight and record that all in a centralized computer. So very powerful from an experimental point of view. Not only can we get individual animal feed intake, but we also can capture a lot of feeding behavior data, which could have implications for traits like efficiency. In addition, this system, you can't see it here because the hoods are flipped up, but there is actually an electronic gate that controls access to each of those feed bunks. So although we have 3 feed bunks per pen, we potentially could feed 3 different rations within that pen and assign permissions to those individual cows to eat only from an assigned bunk. And so this means that we can gain some experimental power by feeding more treatments within each pen. So that's super beneficial in terms of kind of reducing the cost of research because it means that we can use less animals and get more detailed information from fewer animals. In addition, a lot of this data, there's been an increased effort to integrate that data into a centralized database. So the Elora Center, both on the beef side and the dairy side, have a large database that's in development that can be used to research kind of historical data where some other researchers may be interested in doing some big data analysis and some machine learning type analysis on centrally collected data. And so all of the feed intake as well as some other information is integrated centrally, which also helps for data preservation as well as ease of access for researchers. So certainly in the era of data, we are certainly part of that and contribute significantly to that database. Now, in addition to the cow barn, certainly one thing that was renovated as well was the new office and lab facilities. So this is a significant improvement over the old Elora Center. Certainly it provides us with centralized lab space. You can see in the bottom here, we have a nice common lab equipped with drying ovens, which is something that we didn't have on site before. Which allows us to not only process samples faster, but improves the quality of the samples that we can take and the preservation of those samples and leads to better lab analysis down the line. So certainly beneficial to have that on site. In addition, you can see in this picture here, we have what we call the clean lab. And so certainly in the era of genetics and genomics, trying to preserve DNA or RNA-based samples. Oftentimes, the faster you can preserve that sample, the better quality it is. And so we do have an area there set up that we can preserve those samples as quickly and cleanly as possible, which again helps with data integrity. In addition to kind of the researcher area, the new office also has a small meeting room. And so obviously outside of COVID times, there could be opportunities to host small meetings and research group meetings right there on site. And so that is certainly a major advantage that we didn't have before in the old facilities. Now, in addition to the cow-calf barn, we are also renovating our feedlot facilities. So if you take a drive currently down the second line, you will notice there's still a lot of construction happening, and that is part of our new feedlot area. So you could see in my kind of picture that I took about 2 weeks ago that the barn is still under construction. It is scheduled to open in late 2021, and hopefully that everything is still on track for that date. Similar to the cow barn, we are looking at maximizing individual data capture, and this barn as well will be equipped with incentive feeders to monitor feed intake and data capture on our feedlot animals as well. This barn will have 24 pens with 12 to be 288 head capacity in the feedlot. So currently right now, because the feedlot's under construction, we are using the second wing of the cow barn for feedlot projects. And so we're just about to start a research project right now looking at the impacts of undegradable NDF and fiber requirements on feedlot animals, and the impact on rumen health and rumen pH. And so one of the things we were able to get with the new research barn are these rumen probes. And so these indwelling probes, they're about the length of a pen, and they are essentially data loggers that you pass into the animal like a bolus, and they sit in the rumen and monitor pH and temperature at 5-second intervals. And so at slaughter, we can collect these probes and analyze the data to get information on pH and rumen kinetics within the rumen. So another really cool piece of technology. In addition, we are very uniquely equipped here in Guelph to be able to do farm to fork research. So with our also newly renovated federally inspected abattoir housed within the Department of Animal Bioscience, we can definitely take what we do at the research station directly through the abattoir, and even with our collaboration with some researchers in food science to the consumer level to look at consumer traits as well. And as I mentioned, this is certainly a unique setup within Canada, and definitely provides a complete picture of research, taking into account that meat quality and consumer acceptance aspect of our research as well. So now I will turn it over to Dr. Mandell, and he will talk a little bit more about our pasture resources.
So thank you, Katie, and I'd like to thank the organizers for Profitable Pastures for inviting us. So what I want to start off with is kind of talk about what our pasture resources were about 3 years ago and all the major changes that have occurred. So if we go to Elora, we've had 60 acres of roughland pasture, and then we had approximately 72 acres of pasture that was set up for rotational grazing. And how this was set up is that we had 4-acre fields with 8 half-acre paddocks per field to handle 4 cow-calf pairs. And in this rotational grazing pastures, there really hadn't been any major changes in the botanical composition since the early 2000s. If we go to New Liskeard, right now we have 400 acres of pasture spread over 3 different locations. Part of the station is for sale, and we'll probably lose 100 acres when that land does get sold. The pasture field side is quite variable depending on the location of the pastures at New Liskeard. And we've used these pastures predominantly for the breeding herd, and that's what we've used the Elora pastures for. But also in New Liskeard, we've also bought in cattle and looked at the production of grass-fed beef. Okay, so across from the cow barns, we've actually developed new pasture at Elora, and what you can see here is the footprint of the pasture. These pastures were developed in the spring of 2019. At the top of this diagram, we actually have 12 2.5-acre pasture fields that have been set up for strip grazing, and then we have another 15 pasture fields that were originally set up for rotational grazing. And if we look at these 15 pasture fields, for the most part, most of them are 8-acre fields that are set up with 8 1-acre paddock. And here's some pictures of cattle on pasture last year. And so the way it was set up was, again, as an intensive rotational pasture. We actually have a completely covered pasture handling facility, so we can collect in terms of getting body weights, doing ultrasound, collecting blood samples, which is quite different than we had in the past where we were completely exposed to the elements. And we've been looking at in regards to fall grazing, we're going to be looking at various grazing strategies and looking at a blend of different forage blends in our research. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the work that's been going on. So in those 12 2.5 acre fields I showed you earlier, we started a stockpile grazing trial last fall, where we're dealing with a grass mix that was based on orchard grass, meadow fescue, bluegrass, meadow brome, tall fescue, and festilolium. And this trial is actually a collaborative trial with researchers at the Ag Canada Research Station in Nepean, Nova Scotia. And the way this has been set up, we have 3 pasture treatments with 4 replicates per treatment. We have 4 pasture fields with only grasses. We then have another 4 pasture fields where we've added alfalfa, so that ideally alfalfa will make up about 40% of the total botanical composition in the forage. And then we have another 4 fields where we've seeded birchfoot trefoil. And again, the goal is that trefoil will make up about 40% of total botanical composition. Last year was our first year, and we more or less, throughout the summer, we harvested the growing forage as hay. And then in August, we started stockpiling the forage. We didn't start grazing until the end of October. And in each field, we had 400 kilogram heifers per field. We're going to repeat the same protocol depending on the amount of precipitation we get and the weather. So if we look at these 15 pasture fields for rotational grazing, we use the same grass mixtures as stated for the stockpiled pastures, but also these fields have been seeded with birchfoot trefoil and white clover. And Katie Wood will actually later describe how 8 of these 15 pastures were used in 2020. So if we look at the pasture resources today, when we include these pastures I just described, we've added the 32 acres that were being used now for stockpile grazing. Those 15 pasture fields give us another 117 acres for rotational grazing. We've retained those 60 acres of roughland pasture. And then those 72 acres that I mentioned that have been used for rotational grazing have been completely renovated in regards to the pasture layout and the botanical composition. And we've also added another 48 acres in pasture from land that was previously used for crop production. And then Kim Schneider will later describe how these last 2 pastures are being used. What I want to start talking about is some of the research that's just going to be starting this year, both at Elora and New Liskeard. And we have a big name for this title, looking at pasture management strategies and how it impacts carbon sequestration, soil health, and forage productivity for optimizing cow-calf performance using sustainable production practices. And what we're looking here in this study, we want to look at everything in regards to not only animal performance and pasture productivity, but also looking at soil health and looking at carbon sequestration, so we can look at sustainable beef production, along with looking at how these different strategies are going to impact cost of production. And the ultimate goal is we want to be able to make recommendations to beef producers how the various pasture management strategies we're evaluating will not only impact performance, but also how they'll affect the environment and cost of production to help producers make better decisions for sustainable beef production. And here we look at the research team. We have a quite diverse research team. So myself and Katie Wood as the beef cattle nutritionists on the project. We have Carrie Dunfield and John Lazone from the School of Environmental Sciences to help with the work on the soil microbiome and soil health. Joshua Nasielski and Kim Schneider from Plant Agriculture for their expertise on pasture production and assessing pasture quality. Andres Booker from Food and Rural Economics at the University of Guelph, who's going to be looking at cost of production with these various management strategies. And then Christine O'Reilly and James Byrne with their expertise from OMAFRA, so to help with examining pasture production and assessing beef cattle performance. If we look at the Elora component, what we're going to be doing, we're going to be looking at 5 different grazing management strategies in those 15 fields that I previously described. And we're going to replicate each strategy with 3 fields, and we'll have 8 cow-calf pairs per field. What this is going to include, we're going to evaluate continuous grazing, rotational grazing, where we're going to move these cattle every 3 to 4 days based on sward height. We're going to be looking at set stocking, where we're going to keep the cow-calf pairs in the paddock for about 7 days. We're also going to look at set stocking and then afterwards mow the paddocks that have been previously grazed to stimulate regrowth. And then our last grazing management strategy will be strip grazing with cattle moved every day. At New Liskeard, we're going to look at different renovation strategies. And what we've done is we've taken 16 8-acre fields that were last renovated more than 20 years ago. And we've set these fields up so they'll have 8 1-acre paddocks for rotational grazing. And we'll have 5 pasture renovation strategies, again with replicating with 3 fields per strategy, again using 8 cow-calf pairs per field, or we could be using stockers. And our renovation strategies will include pasture left as is. So this pasture that was renovated about 20 years ago. We're going to sod seed with a grass mixture, including tall fescue, meadow fescue, orchard grass, and perennial grass, and include birchfoot trefoil as a legume anchor. We'll do the same sod seeding with the same grass mixture. But in this case, we'll use alfalfa as a legume anchor. Our 4th treatment is that we're going to defoliate the pasture and then seed with the same grass mixture previously described, along with trefoil as a legume anchor. And the last treatment will again defoliate the pasture and seed with a grass mixture, including alfalfa as a legume anchor. And then we're also going to be doing what we call a climate change strategy at New Liskeard, where we're going to compare C3 or cool season grasses with C4 or warm season grasses. And in this study, we're going to be looking at 6 8-acre fields, again with 8 1-acre paddocks. All of these fields have been defoliated. 3 of the fields were seeded with cool season grasses that included meadow brome, tall fescue, smooth brome, intermediate wheatgrass, and Alaska brome. And then 3 fields have been seeded with warm season grasses that include big blue stem and switchgrass. And we wanted to look at how these species would do with impending climate change, because we have been seeing climate change in the north, where 2 of the last 3 summers, cattle were being pulled off pasture in the middle of the summer due to lack of precipitation and then lack of forage for those cattle to eat. The first year, we're looking at establishing the pastures, and then years 2 and 3 will be grazing the pastures. And we want to focus not only on animal performance, but pasture production throughout the season, the changes in botanical composition and nutrient composition, and then whether these C4 grass pastures will actually persist. If we look at all 3 of these studies, the sampling we're going to be doing, we're going to be doing extensive soil samples to look at soil health and also carbon sequestration. We're going to be looking at root functional trait analysis, so looking at the density and the amount of roots, and also looking at the soil microbiome, identifying the species of bacteria and fungi that are present. We'll be doing extensive pasture sampling, looking at yields, botanical composition, and nutrient quality, and then animal performance, how our cow-calf pairs or stockers will gain in weight. And we'll be looking at changes in body condition score and ultrasound fat measurements over the season. And with our cows, we'll be looking at conception data with fixed time AI. I now want to talk a little bit about some of our past work using pasture. And this was a study, actually this study was probably started about 10 years ago. And the reason why this was developed was that when we talk about the production of grass-fed beef in Canada, we have to think about more than pasture due to our climate. So this study was set up to look at method of finishing cattle on alfalfa using either pasture, hay, or silage produced at the New Liskeard station. And we also wanted to compare it to grain-fed beef. And so what we did, we brought in some yearlings that similar in body weight at the end, and they started on trial the 1st of June and over 3 years, and they would end in middle of September. And what we saw was, maybe not surprisingly, is that those grain-fed cattle had much heavier final weights than the forage finished cattle. But we didn't see much difference between method of forage finishing. Again, what we can say, whether we look at gains or feed intake or gain to feed, we're going to see the advantage for grain finishing because of the higher amounts of available energy in a grain-based diet than a forage diet. But what we can actually say when we look at the methods of forage finishing, when we look at gains, feed intake, gain the feed, we see relatively similar values regardless if we're using pasture or finishing the cattle or hay or silage. Again, what we see, hot carcass weight, grade fat, and grade fat, the advantage is to the grain-fed beef. Interesting enough, in this study, our pasture finished beef had heavier carcasses than cattle finished on conserved forages. All of our forage finished cattle had more than enough grade fat to grade as a high quality carcass. And we actually were seeing larger ribeye areas with our forage finished cattle than our grain finished cattle. And if we look at the carcass quality breakdown, not surprising that the grain-fed beef had much greater amounts of AAA carcasses and AA carcasses than the forage finished beef. And we generally saw very relatively non-significant differences in the amount of double weight carcasses based on method of forage finishing. As Katie mentioned earlier, we have a meat lab, an abattoir at the University of Guelph, so we can do quite extensive meat quality evaluation. Shear force is a method where we can use a instrument to actually assess tenderness. And what we do is we cook steaks, core them, and put them on a machine that actually measures the amount of force that cut across the muscle fibers. What we saw in this study was that the grain finished cattle was more tender than the forage finished cattle. Again, not much difference across method of forage finishing. We also fed ribeye steaks to a trained taste panel who had been trained over 2 weeks to learn how to objectively assess tenderness, juiciness, and flavor. In this study, the grain-fed beef was superior to the forage-finished beef in those attributes, with no real differences across method of forage finishing. My lab also did a fatty acid analysis of the beef, and what we see is that the forage-finished beef have much greater amounts of linolenic acid, which is the predominant omega-3 fatty acid that we're going to see in grass-fed beef. And we also saw much greater amounts of total omega-3 fatty acids than grain-fed beef, and a much better polyunsaturated fatty acid to saturated fatty acid ratio in beef. I mean, health professionals want us eating more polyunsaturated fatty acids than saturated fatty acids. Again, we're not seeing a lot of differences between method of forage finishing. This next study is looking at the effect of lactational management. This is work at Elora. And what happened in this study is that we overwintered our cows in the barn, and then they calved in the barn. And then we wanted to look at how these cows would do on pasture versus comparing them to being managed during lactation in dry lot. So what we see, the body weighted calving, very similar between the cows that went out to pasture or the cows that were kept in dry lot. Body weighted weaning, though it's non-significantly different, we see the cows in dry lot had a heavier weight. And what we see is the cows in dry lot had a greater average daily gain than the cows on pasture. That year we had real problems in regards to lack of rain, and so we had problems with poor quality pasture. We didn't see any real differences in looking at body condition score when they first started the study or at weaning, but our ultrasound measurements of back fat showed that our pasture managed cows lost up to 2 millimeters of back fat, while our dry lot cows gained 1 millimeter of back fat, and this is during lactation. Interesting enough, though, when we look at our calves, what we found was that at weaning, our calves on pasture were heavier than our calves that were in dry lot, and we saw we could pick up a greater average daily gain. Also, too, the grad student on this project, she did a quite comprehensive visual assessment of calf health, and the measures in general showed that the calves on pasture were healthier than the calves raised in dry lot. Then a more recent study at New Liskeard, we wanted to look at how soil drainage status and pasture species could affect chemical and botanical composition. There's a typo in that title. And so at New Liskeard, we have some adjacent pastures that are tile drained or not tile drained. And what we did was we seeded a complex grass mixture alone, or with trefoil as a legume anchor, or as alfalfa as a legume anchor. And we assessed them with cattle over 2 consecutive years. And what we see here in regards to protein, NDF, and ADF content, with protein and NDF content, we see a forage effect, which would necessarily not be surprising, but we also see a drainage effect in regards to NDF content, where the pastures where there was no tile drainage, we tend to have a greater fiber content than the pastures that were tiled. And what we were able to do in June, July, and August, we've actually were able to look at the distribution of legumes and grasses and showing some major significant differences due to the effect of whether the pastures were tiled or they weren't tiled. The cattle that were grazed on this study, these were cattle that came from Elora, and they were first on an 84-day growing trial. 2/3 of the cattle came to New Liskeard, and they were placed on these pastures. 1/3 of the cattle stayed at Elora to be finished on a high grain diet. And then the cattle grazed these pastures. Didn't really matter what the forage mix was or the soil drainage status. The cattle basically averaged about 0.95 kilograms average daily gain per day. But in the last slide I want to show you in regards to data, I want to show you something kind of interesting. What we actually did for half of those cattle that we grazed, we kept them at New Liskeard and we finished them on alfalfa silage. And what I want to kind of show you is how these ribeye steaks from these cattle did in comparison to control steaks. And what the control steaks were, they were AAA marbled carcasses at the major beef packing plant in Ontario. And basically what I did was I actually picked out these AAA marbled steaks from these control carcasses. And what we did was we fed these steaks to a trained taste panel. And what I'm showing you here is these animals have been classified that we forage finished based on a growing phase RFI classification. RFI is a measure of feed efficiency. High RFI indicates cattle that are less efficient at converting feed to gain. Low RFI are cattle that are more efficient at converting feed to gain. And so we compared these forage finished cattle, essentially no grain in the 2 years of life that before they were slaughtered, versus these control cattle from AAA marbled carcasses. And what we see is that our forage finished cattle were more tender than this AAA marbled carcasses, with no real differences in overall juiciness and beef flavor. Looking at off flavor, there was no real differences. And with forage finishing, you tend to get off flavors at times due to higher amounts of unsaturated fatty acids. So this was with a trained taste panel. We also gave out packages of 4 steaks to consumers that had 1 steak from each of these treatments. And the consumer panel also found that the beef from these AAA marbled carcasses, which we most likely would be grain finished beef, wasn't as tender as some of this forage finished beef. And the consumer panel found no differences in juiciness, flavor, and overall acceptability. And then here's some more slides from our pastures at Elora. And I'll now let Kim take over.
Okay, thanks, Ira. I'd like to echo the thanks to the organizers for the invitation to present. I'm gonna be a lot faster. I know we're nearing the end of our time, so but I just wanted to talk a little bit about jumping back to Elora. So we have 8 fields that are 8 acres each, so about 64 acres of this renovated perennial pasture. Just an update. Late last summer, we seeded it into these grass species, and then we plan to add white clover and alfalfa in this spring with a drill seeder. We don't have specific funds set up yet for a research trial for this pasture. But what we're leaning towards is a stocking density experiment, where basically we'd have different number of animals, but we'd move them at the same time to see the effect they would have a different residual grazing height, basically, and then we could look at the effects on carbon sequestration, pasture productivity, overall profitability. And we're also looking, there's another 6 8-acre fields that we're hoping, again, a little bit funding dependent how much we can do and for how long, but we're hoping to start to look at the role of annual forages in the grazing system. So 3 of these fields were seeded last year with a little seeding rate trial with fall rye and winter triticale. And then the plan, though, is to have a 2-year rotation where 3 of the fields would be this summer. The other 3 fields would be in a summer, like including some warm season annual forages, go into a winter cereal in the fall after being grazed a couple times, and then that would be grazed because it's all meant to be grazing land. It would be interesting to kind of see if we could incorporate this with annual cash crops, but for now we're just going to be looking at testing the performance of a few different annual forage species and mixtures. And in the next few years, hopefully, again, a little bit funding dependent, but looking at the economics of including annual forages as part of a grazing plan, definitely not to replace perennial forages, but maybe just to be supplementary as needed. And I didn't mention, so we'd also look at fall annual forages kind of after the cereals were grazed a couple times, then it would go into more cool season annual forage to be grazed that fall. Okay, I'm just going to touch briefly. I know we don't have a lot of time, and this is just really, we're just starting to look at the results from a fairly straightforward agronomic forage fertility trial at Elora. This was actually established just before I started on some farm smart land. It was a trial looking at 3 treatments. So there was the OMAFRA soil fertility recommendations, somewhat lighter, generally it's lighter, 100 pounds per acre of triple 19 fertilizer. That kind of came from OMAFRA extension personnel that said that this is a practice that a lot of producers are using on hay or pasture fields. And then we had a 0 fertility control. And we compared in this 19 different entries, or some were straight grasses, just one, I think, straight alfalfa, and then mostly mixtures of species. So really quickly, I know it's a lot of information to process tonight, but basically on this site, what we're finding after 1 year is that the fertilized as needed, according to OMAFRA soil tests, is yielding superior. I mean, it's not significantly different from this 1919, but visually, I think if you were there in the field, you would see a difference. But I must say, this is really site dependent. We had some lower potassium levels to start, so whatever field you're on, it's going to vary. And this is probably maybe somewhat of a, maybe not worst case scenario, but it wasn't totally at ideal fertility to start with. If we look at some of the species, one interesting thing that we've seen so far is we tested some Festuloleum species. I know this is Italian ryegrass. I know these letters don't mean much maybe to you. The GM was just grass mixture. This is a Timothy, and Festuloleum was the F. With the grass mixtures, maybe mainly having like tall fescue orchard grass, perennial rye, mainly in those mixtures. But what we saw, what was interesting was this Festuloleum. Both the tall fescue type and perennial rye type yielded quite well comparatively across the grass blends. This is just after year 1, and we're continuing it 2 more years, so we'll see if that holds true. And the other interesting finding so far that I thought, these are all different legume grass mixtures that had a decent amount of legume content, mostly alfalfa. I mean, there's a lot we could look at, but what I wanted to highlight was the one with red clover actually did the best over the alfalfa. And I think this again comes back to that potassium levels to start with. And so I think it's just an indicator that red clover is more tolerant of lower soil potassium concentrations. Okay, I know we're tight on time. We are doing up at New Liskeard a grass variety trial. Basically, just related to Ira's work, these are different species that are in the pasture mixes. So we've set up some grass plots up at New Liskeard to explore how individual species are yielding, looking at their quality and also their survivability over 3 years. And again, to complement the work that Ira mentioned with C4 warm season perennial grasses, there's just some plots that we're also looking. And we don't know exactly how well it will do up at New Liskeard on the clay soils, but we'll see. The plots aren't much of a high risk, and just they may impart some heat and drought tolerance if we can get them established. So that's it for me, but thanks for listening, and turn it back over to Katie quickly.
All right, thanks, Kim. Let me just flick over here. Oh, we're just remove our remote control. There we go. Okay, so one of the tools that we are also able to have with the research station is we were able to acquire some Feedlot green feed trailers. Certainly the role of cattle in the environment has become increasingly of concern. And so certainly we need to study that in controlled conditions. And this new piece of technology enables us to do that out on pasture. So this a quick little video of how this works. It's a solar powered trailer, and I'll just start the video here and can talk over it. And so we can put these trailers basically anywhere on pasture. Because it's solar powered, we don't need access to hydro or anything like that. And it works with the RFID tag where the animal can come in here and access the feed bunk. The feed trickles out to keep the animal's attention. You can see that this cow here, she's happily consuming a little snack machine as it dispenses that feed. And as she has her nose in the hood, it is sampling gas at the rate of about 40 liters per second. And so the gas is funneled up through the manifold where it is subsampled every second. And that gas is analyzed for methane, CO2, and oxygen. And from there, of course, we can get the impact of methane emissions, as well as potentially some other applications. So this is kind of what some of the data looks like. You can see here in our red line is our methane emissions. And our blue line here is carbon dioxide. Most of the carbon dioxide is coming, of course, from the animal's breath, but there is a little bit that is eructated from the rumen as well. You can see it's time course here. Obviously, at about 1:55 p.m., this drops off, and that indicates that a second animal is actually entered into the feeder for a next set of measurements. And so you could see as the animal has its head in there, usually the CO2 and methane peaks are fairly simultaneous, although they don't necessarily need to be. And within the about 5-minute time period, the animal's head is within the feeder. The animal will usually eructate methane from the rumen about every 30 seconds to a minute. And so you can kind of clearly see regular peaks as that animal is snacking on that little bit of a pellet that the green feeder is dropping. So very kind of useful tool to get an indication of what those methane emissions are. And again, because we don't need power, this can be placed basically anywhere on pasture. And so we've been using this for the past year or so to look at a couple different projects. So of course, one of the big questions is, are there any feed supplements or intervention strategies we can do to reduce methane emissions from cattle? And although a lot of the studies have been done in a more confined lab-based setting, using this type of equipment, we can look at this actually in grazing animals. And so this past year, as Ira mentioned, we did a study looking at biochar, which is a form of engineered carbon, essentially, and to see if supplementation of biochar helps reduce methane emissions in these cows. So this is Emily Conlin's master's project, and here she is down here diligently sampling pasture biomass because we needed an indication of pasture intake as well. And this project's being replicated at the University of Saskatchewan with Dr. Bart Lardner as well. And so we provided the biochar daily to the animals in a feed bunk as in the form of a range pellet at about feeding rate of about ½ kilo per head per day, so relatively small, but we're working through analyzing that data now. The other thing that we're working on is, as I mentioned, the green feeder measures much more than just methane. And so we can actually use the carbon dioxide and oxygen measures as a form, as a way to predict metabolic rate. So using some math equations, we hopefully will able to use this data to help identify feed efficient animals on pasture. So previously, right, we're depending on detailed feed intake measurements to estimate and predict feed efficiency, but hopefully we'll have an answer of whether we can make those same predictions as accurately using just gas exchange data rather than lengthy feed intake studies. So that's a project of Lauren Finley, who you can see here in this picture, running a calibration on the green feeder there. In addition, we're doing some upcoming projects starting in the summer. This will be the project of Courtney Acton, my PhD student. And in this case, we're looking at determining relationships between individual animal fiber digestibility, feed efficiency, and gas exchange, but not just at one time point, over the life cycle of the animal. So we'll be measuring these animals as heifers and then following them as 2-year-old cows to see how that changes kind of over their production cycle. And then of course, with that, one of the big questions we have is, are animals that are identified as efficient, are they always efficient, or are they just simply better at adapting to different diet scenarios? So we'll be, part of that study, we'll be doing a bit of a fiber challenge to see if our more efficient animals are also equally as efficient on low or high quality forage diets. So with that, I know we're short on time. I think I'll just skip over this slide here. Certainly there are a lot of acknowledgements to be made with the development of the new Ontario Beef Research Centre. Certainly the support of AIRO in managing and running the center. We certainly wouldn't be able to do this great research without their support. Certainly between the three of us, we're certainly indebted to all of the funding agencies who continually to support our research and provide funding for these studies to be conducted. In addition, we are very, very fortunate to have a group of absolutely exceptional staff, both at the Elora site and at the New Liskeard site. And they certainly run day-to-day operations and are responsible for some of the phenomenal data quality that they were able to collect at these stations. And they're really, again, really great to work with and very lucky to have such support from the station staff. And so I think we're pretty close to being within our hour. So again, thank you to the Ontario Forage Council for inviting the three of us to speak. Again, hopefully as COVID continues to resolve, we'll be able to host you out at the research center itself in the future, where you can see some of these cool things that we're doing in person. So thank you very much. I think I will turn it over either to Christine or Patricia, and hopefully we left enough time to answer some questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, all three of you. That was very informative and so fascinating to hear about the updates and some of the ongoing projects that you guys are working on. So I think I'll field two questions. I'll pass it over to Patricia for the formal wrap up, and then if anyone wants to stay on past that to get answers to a couple more questions, there are a lot of great ones coming in, but for the sake of time, we'll do two. We'll do the formal wrap up, and then if you do have to leave, don't worry, you're not missing any part of the formal thing, but we'll stay on and we'll answer a few more questions. So Ira, I've got some questions that came in about your grass-fed versus grain-fed trial. Were the cattle used in that project of the same origin? What breeds were used, British or Continental, and were they steers or heifers?
So the first study that we conducted, we had Hereford Angus and Hereford Angus crosses, and they were steers. They were steers. So that the last study that was run over 2 years. The first year we probably had 2/3 Angus, 1/3 Continental, and they were Charolais. And that actually caused us some problems when we market them as forage finished beef. We getting several B carcasses. The last year of that study, they were all Angus based, and it was actually quite interesting. We had 8 prime out of 60 odd head that went to slaughter. And they were again a little bit over 2 years of age, and all they had in regards to grain was over an 84-day period, they had 20% of their diet was corn silage. So they actually did quite well on a forage-based diets.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure which of you wants to field this next question, so I'll let you guys figure that one out. But The question is, why do you want to have a legume anchor like alfalfa in your rotated pastures? From a nutritional perspective, wouldn't you have enough protein with just grass? And they're asking because after a few years, the alfalfa will thin out of the stand. It won't be at the percentage that you planted. So why do you want a legume in your pasture?
Well, I think some for drought tolerance.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. And yeah, I can't really speak from the nutritional side, but from the environmental side, I guess we're trying to have legumes in there to fix nitrogen so we can lessen the fertilizer used, and also that some, instead of just white clover, like a deeper rooted legume that there's some evidence that can have some soil carbon building effects, and add some drought tolerance, so hopefully increase the yield in the summer slump time.
All right, thanks. You talked a bit about some upcoming pasture. Oh wait, I've said after 2 questions. I'm gonna give it back to Patricia. I'm sorry, I got excited. They asked great questions. Patricia, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Christine. On behalf of the Ontario Forage Council, I'd like to extend a very special thank you to Doctors Katie Wood, Kim Schneider, and Ira Mandell for their presentations and time tonight. Another big thank you, excuse me, to Christine O'Reilly and Michelle Linnington from OMAFRA for their planning and tech assistance for this event. Our presenters have agreed to stay on after the formal webinar for further questions, as you know, so please stay online and take advantage of this opportunity. Please take a moment to visit ontarioforagecouncil.com for information on how to register for the 3 remaining webinars in this series. Tomorrow we will hear from New Zealand's Dr. Jim Gibbs on grazing fodder beet. So thanks again for your support and the support of our sponsors on these webinars. Have a wonderful evening.
All right, I get to ask more questions. So yeah, there was a question that came in. You're planning some big pasture projects coming up in the next few years. How are you going to measure pasture yield in those experiments?
Yeah, I think I just answered this in the chat too, but it might have just went to one. We're planning to measure the forage biomass before and after grazing, approximately on a weekly basis, to see amount of forage that was consumed, and then we will add that up kind of over the season, if that makes sense.
Okay, thanks. You also talked a bit about an annual forage study. So what are the main summer species that you're looking at for those annual forages?
Yeah, so we're looking at trying to include different functional groups, like a cool season grass, a warm season grass, a legume, and potentially another broadleaf crop. We're still in the final decision-making process, so if anyone has input, but we were looking at, for the C3s, oats and Italian ryegrass, for the C4 grasses, pearl millet, and potentially sorghum sudan grass. We're quite interested in berseem clover because we've seen some good results with it in the last couple of years. And in the fall, so that would be more for the summer, and maybe chicory is one that we're looking at. In the fall, it would probably be focus more on the cool season species, or late summer. Probably again, 1 or 2 C3 grasses like oats, and then a brassica. We'd like at least one brassica and a legume again in the fall. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Kim. And Ira, I've got another question about your forage-based beef project. So at which point in the forage-based steers in the grass-fed beef, I guess when were they fed the 84 days of corn silage is the question.
The first 84 days they were on feed. They got the diet that was predominantly alfalfa silage with well, it was like 25% corn silage in the diet. And then after that 84 days, they were on pasture for basically it was June till late September. And then they went on alfalfa silage from late September until they were slaughtered the following March.
All right. Thank you so much. I think we managed to capture everybody's quest. Oh, someone slipped one in right at the end. Thanks, Jean-Marc. So another question for you, Ira. Are there any plans to evaluate pasture performance, backgrounding Angus cross Holstein dairy beef, given the increasing trend to AI Angus bulls to dairy cows?
I think that's something that could possibly be looked at in the future once once our feedlot is operational. So we've been constrained over the last couple years with the building of the feedlot that we had to. Our feedlot studies were going on in the cow barns, and we're not allowed to bring in cattle that are outside the breeding herd into that cow barn. With the new feedlot that's available at the end of this year, we could entertain those type of studies, and we would have pasture available to actually look at those dairy beef crosses.
Okay. Well, I'd like to thank all three of you again for taking time to tell us about your research in the new facilities, and also thank everyone for hanging out with us this evening and asking such fantastic questions. So take care, everybody, and hopefully we'll see you back here tomorrow night for our fodder beat talk. Have a good one.